In the quiet aftermath of a failed robbery in Blackwater, long before the sun could rise over the American frontier, a small group of outlaws moved slowly through a landscape buried in snow, their horses breathing heavy clouds into the freezing air as they searched for shelter among the mountains. This was the beginning of their exile. The Van der Linde gang, once confident and ambitious, now found itself fractured and hunted, retreating deeper into the unforgiving wilderness, where survival depended not on dreams of freedom, but on fire, food, and fragile trust. At the center of this silent migration rode Arthur Morgan, a man shaped by loyalty and habit rather than ideology, whose calm exterior concealed a lifetime of obedience to a vision that was beginning to fade. The storm that surrounded them felt symbolic, as if nature itself were reminding the gang that their era was ending, that the open frontier they once knew was shrinking beneath the weight of railroads, lawmen, and modern civilization. When they finally reached the abandoned mining town of Coulter, the wooden structures stood frozen and lifeless, creaking softly under the pressure of wind and ice, offering temporary refuge, but no real safety. Inside those dimly lit cabins, the gang attempted to rebuild a sense of unity. Dutch Van der Linde, charismatic and eloquent as ever, spoke of plans and patience, insisting that this setback was merely a temporary obstacle on the path to something greater. His voice carried warmth in the cold air, yet beneath his words lingered a tension that even Arthur could not ignore. Food was scarce, supplies were limited, trust was fragile. The early days in Coulter were defined not by grand missions, but by quiet routines of survival. Hunting in the snow required patience and careful aim. Rescuing lost members meant braving blizzards with steady hands and measured courage. Arthur rode through white silence, his horse's hooves pressing into untouched snow as distant mountains blurred into the pale horizon. The world felt suspended, as though time itself had slowed to match the heavy rhythm of the storm. It was during these opening hours that the true tone of the story revealed itself. This was not a tale of glory, but of endurance. Arthur's interactions with John Marston, who had been injured and left vulnerable in the mountains, reflected the unspoken bond between men who had grown together under Dutch's guidance. There was no dramatic speech, no heroic declaration, only practical assistance and shared history. In the cold stillness of Coulter, the gang's illusion of control quietly began to crack. Dutch's optimism remained strong, yet small decisions hinted at impatience. Micah Bell's presence introduced subtle discord, his aggressive tone contrasting sharply with Arthur's measured restraint. Snow continued to fall. Fires continued to burn. Plans continued to be spoken. Yet beneath it all, a question lingered without words. How long could this way of life survive in a world that was rapidly changing? The mountains did not answer. They simply stood in silence, vast and indifferent, watching as a group of outlaws prepared for a journey that would test loyalty, morality, and identity in ways none of them fully understood. And so, in that frozen beginning, surrounded by wind and white horizons, the final chapter of the Van der Linde gang quietly began. As the snow slowly loosened its grip on the mountains, and the Van der Linde gang descended toward greener valleys. A fragile sense of warmth began to return, not only to the landscape, but also to the hearts of those who had survived the freezing exile. They settled near Horseshoe Overlook, where rolling hills stretched beneath open skies and the distant sound of rivers replaced the harsh silence of the blizzard. For a brief moment, the world felt softer. Camp life introduced a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of Black Water and the isolation of Coulter. Tents were raised carefully, wagons positioned with intention, and a central fire became the quiet heart of the gang's temporary home. Around that fire, stories were told in low voices. Coffee simmered in battered pots, and laughter occasionally cut through the evening air. Arthur Morgan moved through the space not as a hero, but as a steady presence. He chopped wood, carried supplies, fed horses, and listened more than he spoke. His strength lay not in dramatic declarations, but in consistency. Dutch van der Linde, ever the visionary, continued speaking of freedom and a better future somewhere beyond the reach of modern law. His speeches carried a poetic quality that inspired hope. Yet even in these peaceful days, subtle shifts in tone suggested that ambition was beginning to overshadow caution. Hosea Matthews, wiser and quieter, often balanced Dutch's intensity with measured advice, acting as a stabilizing force within the group. Through gentle conversations and thoughtful strategy, he reminded Arthur that survival required patience as much as courage. The camp was more than a base of operations. It was a living ecosystem of personalities. Sadie Adler, still grieving and finding her strength, moved cautiously yet determinedly through daily tasks. Lenny Summers brought youthful energy and optimism. Charles Smith carried a quiet moral compass that resonated with Arthur's own growing introspection. Daily routines reinforced a sense of belonging. Hunting trips into the surrounding plains required precision and respect for the land. Fishing by the river offered moments of reflection. Even simple chores, repairing wagons, gathering herbs, maintaining weapons, contributed to the illusion of stability. Yet beneath the surface of camaraderie, cracks began forming. Micah Bell's presence introduced a sharper edge to conversations. His impulsive nature and appetite for risk clashed subtly with Arthur's instinct for caution. While Dutch appeared fascinated by Micah's boldness, others observed quietly, uncertain of the long-term consequences. As the gang conducted small robberies and negotiated with local contacts, the tension between idealism and practicality grew more noticeable. Dutch's dream of freedom required constant motion, yet every move attracted attention. Arthur, often tasked with enforcing order, began sensing that loyalty was becoming more complicated than simple obedience. He remained devoted to Dutch, yet subtle doubts lingered in unspoken moments of silence. Evenings in camp felt peaceful on the surface. The sky would dim into shades of gold and deep blue, lanterns casting gentle light across worn faces, while distant coyotes called into the night. Music drifted softly from a harmonica. Cards shuffled slowly between careful hands. In these moments, the gang felt like a family. But families, like outlaws, are bound together by fragile threads. The world beyond Horseshoe Overlook was changing. Railroads expanded steadily. Cities like St. Denis represented progress that left little room for wandering gunslingers. The camp, warm and familiar, existed within borrowed time. And as Arthur sat quietly by the fire, staring into flames that flickered against the dark, he could not yet know that this fragile brotherhood was already beginning to unravel. As the days in Horseshoe Overlook stretched into weeks, and the warmth of the valley slowly replaced the harsh memory of the mountains, a subtle transformation began unfolding within the Van der Linde gang, one that was not immediately visible in gunfights or robberies, but instead revealed itself through tone, hesitation, and the quiet shifts in trust that often precede collapse. Dutch van der Linde continued to present himself as the unshakable visionary, speaking passionately about freedom, civilization's corruption, and the inevitability of a new beginning somewhere far beyond the tightening grip of federal law. Yet beneath his eloquence, there emerged a growing impatience that Arthur Morgan could not entirely ignore. Decisions that were once calculated and measured gradually became impulsive, as though Dutch were attempting to outrun something more psychological than physical. The arrival of new opportunities, particularly the idea of larger, riskier scores, appealed to Dutch's sense of grandeur, and Micah Bell's influence during this period intensified that appeal. Micah's worldview was sharper, more confrontational, and far less sentimental than Hosea's cautious pragmatism. And as Dutch listened more closely to Micah's aggressive confidence, the balance within the leadership dynamic subtly shifted. Arthur, who had long functioned as Dutch's most loyal enforcer, found himself observing rather than blindly acting, sensing that the moral clarity that once defined the gang's internal code was beginning to blur. What had once been justified as rebellion against oppressive systems slowly started resembling recklessness driven by pride. The town of Valentine became a stage upon which these fractures began showing themselves more clearly. Seemingly routine encounters escalated more quickly than before, and Arthur often noticed how Dutch's speeches were becoming increasingly theatrical, almost as though he needed constant affirmation from his audience. Even small robberies carried an undercurrent of tension, not simply because of law enforcement, but because the gang itself was no longer moving with unified instinct. Hosea, whose presence had always provided equilibrium, appeared increasingly concerned, offering suggestions that favored caution and long-term survival rather than spectacle. Yet his influence, though respected, seemed to weaken against Dutch's swelling rhetoric and Micah's opportunistic encouragement. In quiet conversations between Arthur and John Marston, a different kind of uncertainty emerged, one rooted not in fear of the law, but in doubt about the direction in which they were traveling. Arthur, who had spent most of his life accepting Dutch's philosophy as truth, began experiencing something unfamiliar, reflection without conclusion. His loyalty remained intact, but it was no longer unquestioning. As the gang moved southward toward new territories and larger ambitions, the environment itself symbolized transition. The open plains gave way to busier roads, structured towns, and signs of industrial expansion. Rail lines stretched across landscapes that once belonged only to riders and wanderers. reminding the gang that time was not standing still. Each mission now carried a heavier emotional weight. Failed negotiations, unexpected betrayals, and the increasing presence of Pinkerton agents signaled that their methods were becoming outdated in a rapidly modernizing world. Yet instead of retreating strategically, Dutch appeared to double down, interpreting resistance as proof that they were on the brink of something monumental rather than on the edge of extinction. Arthur watched these developments with restrained concern, his internal conflict deepening not through dramatic confrontation, but through accumulating silence. He still rode at the front during dangerous operations. He still defended the camp. He still followed orders. But his eyes lingered longer on the consequences. The camp itself began reflecting these tensions in subtle ways. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter felt less spontaneous. Even the music around the evening fire carried a softer melancholy, as though the group sensed that their unity was no longer instinctive, but maintained through effort. In this phase of the story, loyalty did not shatter all at once. It thinned gradually, like ice warming under unseen sunlight. The gang still moved together, still shared meals, still spoke of distant horizons. Yet beneath those routines lay a fragile understanding that something essential had begun to shift. Arthur could not yet articulate the transformation, but he felt it in the pauses between Dutch's speeches and in the weight of decisions that no longer felt entirely righteous. And so, as the frontier continued shrinking and the world around them advanced toward inevitability, the Van der Linde gang unknowingly stepped into the beginning of its internal unraveling, guided not by fate alone, but by the subtle erosion of trust that no outlaw code could fully repair. As the Van der Linde gang drifted further south and eventually found themselves on the edge of St. Denis, the illusion that they still belonged to an untamed frontier began dissolving with increasing clarity, replaced by the overwhelming presence of a world that no longer tolerated romantic visions of outlaw freedom. St. Denis was not merely another town. It was a symbol of industrial momentum, structured authority, and relentless modernization. Brick buildings towered over muddy streets, electric lights shimmered against the humid air, and factory smoke curled into a sky that felt narrower than the open plains Arthur had once ridden across without thought. In this city, horses felt slower, revolvers felt outdated, and conversations carried the formal tone of contracts rather than campfire promises. Dutch, however, interpreted the city differently. To him, St. Denis represented opportunity disguised as hostility, a place where one final, ambitious move could secure the gang's future and validate years of restless wandering. His speeches grew more urgent and theatrical, as though he were not only convincing the gang, but attempting to silence his own uncertainty. Arthur observed these developments with growing introspection. The crimes committed in and around St. Denis required precision and restraint, yet they increasingly escalated into chaos. The botched trolley station robbery and the disastrous bank job did not merely represent tactical failures. They exposed how disconnected the gang's methods had become from the rapidly organizing society surrounding them. The city operated through systems, law enforcement networks, financial institutions, political structures, that outlaws could not simply intimidate or outrun. Every action produced swift consequences. Every miscalculation tightened the noose. Hosea's death during the St. Denis Bank robbery marked a profound rupture within the gang's moral center. His absence was not loud or dramatic. It manifested as a hollow silence where reason had once spoken calmly. Arthur felt this loss deeply, not through tears or visible breakdown, but through a heavy awareness that something essential had been removed. Dutch's response to mounting setbacks shifted from strategic recalibration to defiant denial. Rather than acknowledging error, he reframed each failure as proof of persecution, insisting that external forces were solely responsible for their misfortune. His language remained poetic, yet its foundation grew unstable. Arthur began recognizing that loyalty to a man was not identical to loyalty to an idea. Dutch's dream of freedom, once rooted in resistance to injustice, seemed increasingly detached from reality, sustained more by ego than by principle. The gang's temporary relocation to the swamps of Lemoyne further emphasized their displacement. The humid air, dense foliage, and shadowed waters of the bayou created an atmosphere thick with unease. Civilization pressed inward from every direction, and even nature felt less like refuge and more like confinement. Encounters with figures such as Angelo Bronte illustrated how crime itself had evolved. Organized networks replaced spontaneous outlaw raids. Power operated quietly behind closed doors rather than in open standoffs. Arthur sensed that their traditional code of honor had little relevance in this structured corruption. The failed confrontation with Bronte and the escalating Pinkerton pursuit confirmed that St. Denis was not simply another chapter in their journey, but the beginning of irreversible unraveling. Arthur's internal conflict deepened in subtle ways. He found himself questioning not only Dutch's judgment, but his own past compliance. Every order followed, every trigger pulled, every silent acceptance now carried retrospective weight. Even the camp's atmosphere changed. Conversations turned cautious. Trust thinned further. Micah's influence strengthened as he aligned himself more visibly with Dutch's aggressive decisions, reinforcing the cycle of risk and denial. The world was no longer distant. It was closing in with structure, law, and inevitability. Arthur could feel it in the tightened patrol routes, in the watchful eyes of city residents, in the absence of true wilderness between settlements. For the first time, escape no longer seemed like a direction on a map, but an illusion sustained by nostalgia. And as St. Denis glowed under artificial light, while the gang prepared for increasingly desperate plans, the frontier that once promised infinite horizons quietly receded into memory. The diagnosis did not arrive with dramatic music or visible collapse, but through a quiet visit to a doctor's office in St. Denis, where sterile walls and measured voices replaced the open air Arthur Morgan had always known. And in that confined space, the illusion of invincibility dissolved into a simple, irreversible truth. He was dying. Tuberculosis, contracted months earlier during a routine debt collection that once seemed insignificant, now revealed itself as the invisible consequence of a life built on force and unquestioned obedience. The disease did not transform Arthur overnight, nor did it immediately weaken his physical strength. But it altered something far deeper, introducing a slow awareness that time, once assumed to be endless, had become painfully finite. As his cough grew heavier and his breathing occasionally faltered, Arthur began writing not with urgency, but with contemplation, noticing details he had previously ignored: the way sunlight filtered through trees, the distant hum of insects near the riverbanks, and the fragile stillness of dawn before the camp stirred awake. The world, which had once been a stage for action, gradually became a mirror. Dutch's plans continued escalating in ambition, particularly after the failed Garma episode and the mounting pressure from Pinkerton agents. Yet Arthur no longer heard those speeches with the same unquestioning loyalty. He listened carefully, but with distance, recognizing that the dream of freedom had shifted into a performance sustained by pride rather than principle. Conversations with Sister Calderon in St. Denis marked a subtle but profound turning point. In her calm presence, Arthur spoke more honestly than he ever had, admitting fear not of death itself, but of dying without meaning. Her quiet reassurance did not promise redemption, but it offered perspective, suggesting that even a flawed life could leave behind something gentle. This possibility lingered in Arthur's thoughts as he reconsidered his role within the gang. Protecting John Marston and encouraging him to prioritize his family began feeling less like strategy and more like responsibility. Arthur's loyalty redirected itself not toward Dutch's fading vision, but toward the survival of those who might still build a different future. The gang's internal fractures widened visibly during this period. Micah's influence intensified, feeding Dutch's growing paranoia in framing dissent as betrayal. Where once Arthur would have responded with immediate force, he now hesitated, evaluating motives and consequences with a patience shaped by mortality. Physical weakness advanced gradually, each coughing fit serving as a reminder that strength was temporary and that legacy depended less on violence than on choice. Arthur's honor system, once a gameplay mechanic, now embodied his internal reckoning. Acts of kindness helping strangers, forgiving debts, protecting the vulnerable became deliberate affirmations of identity rather than incidental gestures. Even the landscape seemed to reflect his transformation. Sunsets carried a warmer hue. Quiet riverbanks invited reflection. The rhythm of hoofbeats slowed into something almost meditative, as though the frontier itself were offering a final moment of clarity before disappearing into history. Arthur's awakening was not loud or revolutionary. It unfolded through restraint. He did not confront Dutch with theatrical accusation, nor did he abandon the gang impulsively. Instead, he began guiding outcomes quietly, ensuring that John had resources to escape and that the most innocent members were shielded from impending collapse. In accepting his mortality, Arthur paradoxically gained autonomy. The fear that once bound him to Dutch's approval loosened its grip, replaced by an internal compass oriented toward dignity rather than survival alone. The illness did not define him, but it revealed him. And in the slow cadence of approaching death, Arthur Morgan discovered a form of freedom that no outlaw dream had ever fully provided: the freedom to choose how his story would end. By the time the Van der Linde gang returned from Garma, and regrouped on American soil. The fragile cohesion that once defined their brotherhood had thinned into something brittle, held together less by shared belief and more by habit, fear, and the momentum of unfinished plans that no longer promised salvation. Dutch van der Linde no longer resembled the measured idealist who once balanced ambition with restraint. His rhetoric remained poetic, yet it had grown increasingly detached from tangible reality, transforming setbacks into grand conspiracies and dissent into betrayal. The more the world closed in around him through Pinkerton pressure, failed robberies, and mounting casualties, the more he interpreted caution as weakness rather than wisdom. Arthur Morgan, weakened physically but sharpened internally by illness and reflection, observed this transformation with a clarity that felt both painful and inevitable. Where he once would have defended Dutch without hesitation, he now evaluated each decision through the lens of consequence, recognizing that loyalty without accountability had become dangerous. Micah Bell's influence reached its peak during this period, as he positioned himself not merely as an ally to Dutch, but as an amplifier of Dutch's most reckless impulses. Micah spoke in absolutes, framing the gang's struggles as proof that only aggression could restore dominance. His confidence fed Dutch's pride, creating an echo chamber in which dissenting voices, particularly Arthur's and John's, were gradually marginalized. The camp atmosphere deteriorated in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations shortened. Suspicion replaced warmth. Even routine activities carried an undercurrent of tension, as though every member sensed that unity had become conditional. When internal confrontations finally surfaced, they did not erupt from nowhere. They were the culmination of accumulated silence. Arthur's attempts to question Dutch's increasingly erratic strategies were met not with dialogue, but with defensiveness. Dutch no longer sought consensus. He sought affirmation. The turning point arrived with the revelation of Micah's betrayal and the escalating hostility between former brothers. Accusations flew not merely as tactical disputes, but as moral indictments. Arthur's illness, once a private burden, became visible proof that time was running short, not only for him, but for the gang's cohesion. In these final days together, the gang resembled a house built on weathered wood, swaying under the weight of pride and paranoia. Some members chose to leave quietly, prioritizing survival over allegiance. Others remained out of loyalty, fear, or lack of alternative. Arthur's priorities shifted entirely toward ensuring John Marston's escape. He no longer believed in distant islands or grand new beginnings promised by Dutch. Instead, he believed in something smaller and more immediate, the possibility that at least one member of the gang could break free from the cycle. The confrontation on the mountain ridge crystallized the irreversible fracture. As accusations culminated in physical struggle and gunfire echoed across the fading frontier, Arthur understood that the gang he had served since youth no longer existed as a coherent entity. What remained were individuals clinging to incompatible visions. Dutch's final hesitation, his refusal to fully side with Arthur or Micah, symbolized the ultimate erosion of certainty. In that moment, Arthur saw clearly that Dutch's dream had not been malicious, but it had become consumed by ego and denial. The collapse was not loud in its conclusion. It was tragic in its inevitability. Bonds forged through years of shared danger dissolved into mistrust within hours. Brotherhood gave way to survival instinct. As the dust settled and the gang scattered into fragments, Arthur recognized that the era of the Linde gang had ended not because of external enemies alone, but because the internal trust that sustained it had eroded beyond repair. The frontier was shrinking, the law was advancing, and the illusion of eternal rebellion had finally met reality. In that collapse, Arthur did not feel hatred. He felt clarity. When the fractures within the Linde gang finally split beyond repair, and the mountains once again stood as silent witnesses to betrayal, Arthur Morgan understood that the time for negotiation, persuasion, and reluctant loyalty had passed, leaving behind only one final responsibility that mattered more than pride, more than revenge, and even more than survival itself. Ensuring John Marston's escape became not merely a practical objective, but a moral culmination of everything Arthur had come to realize about the fragile nature of freedom and the weight of choice. As he rode alongside John through forested trails and fading light, the world felt quieter than it ever had before, as though the frontier itself were lowering its voice to match the gravity of the moment. The air carried the scent of pine and distant rain, and the rhythmic sound of hooves pressing against soft earth formed a steady cadence beneath Arthur's labored breathing. His illness, once a distant shadow, now announced itself with persistent heaviness in his chest, yet his movements remained deliberate and controlled, guided not by panic, but by acceptance. In those final hours, memories surfaced not as chaotic flashes, but as calm recollections. Evenings around the campfire, laughter shared in temporary safety, Dutch's early speeches about equality and rebellion, and the unspoken brotherhood that had once bound them together with certainty rather than doubt. Arthur no longer clung to the idea of repairing what had been broken. Instead, he focused entirely on protecting what could still be preserved. He urged John forward, insisting that Abigail and Jack deserved a future untouched by endless flight and gunfire, recognizing that true loyalty sometimes required stepping away rather than standing firm. The confrontation that followed with Micah Bell and Dutch unfolded not as a heroic spectacle, but as the inevitable collision of diverging truths. Accusations were spoken not to persuade, but to reveal. Dutch's silence in that moment carried more weight than any declaration he could have made, because it confirmed what Arthur had slowly understood. The dream had dissolved long before the gang physically scattered. When Arthur found himself alone on the mountain ridge, the sky above him stretched wide and luminous, painted in the warm tones of approaching sunrise. He did not reach for grand gestures or dramatic last words. Instead, he sat quietly, allowing the vast landscape to fill his vision one final time. The wind moved gently across the grass. The horizon remained steady and indifferent. Arthur's breathing slowed, not in struggle, but in surrender to the natural rhythm of a life that had been intense, flawed, and ultimately reflective. If his journey had begun in cold exile among the snow-covered peaks, it ended in golden light, overlooking a frontier that was no longer his to chase. In those final moments, there was no rage left, no demand for justice, no desperate attempt to reclaim control. There was only clarity, and within that clarity, a quiet understanding that redemption does not always arrive as absolution, but sometimes as a choice made just in time. Arthur Morgan did not escape the world he had helped shape. He did not rewrite history, but he ensured that someone else could. And as the sun rose gently above the hills, casting long shadows over the fading age of outlaws, his story closed not with noise, but with stillness. After Arthur Morgan's final breath faded into the morning light, the world did not pause, nor did the frontier offer tribute to a fallen outlaw, because history moves forward without ceremony, carrying both the guilty and the redeemed into whatever comes next. Yet within that quiet continuation, John Marston found himself standing at the fragile edge of possibility, holding in his hands the responsibility Arthur had fought to preserve. The years that followed were not shaped by grand robberies or daring escapes, but by small, deliberate choices that slowly replaced chaos with structure. John's journey toward building a ranch at Beecher's Hope did not unfold with cinematic triumph, but with awkward labor, financial uncertainty, and the steady learning curve of a man who had spent most of his life riding away from consequences rather than settling down to face them. Fencing land, hammering nails into timber, and negotiating modest agreements with neighboring farmers became acts of quiet rebellion against his former existence. Each plank of wood placed into the foundation of his home represented a refusal to continue the endless cycle of flight and violence that had defined the van der Linde gang. Abigail's cautious optimism and Jack's innocent curiosity provided a different form of motivation, one that did not rely on loyalty to a charismatic leader, but on consistency and patience. John struggled at times with the simplicity of domestic life, his instincts still shaped by years of danger, yet the absence of constant gunfire gradually revealed that stability required courage equal to any outlaw confrontation. The final reckoning with Micah Bell, which drew Dutch van der Linde back into John's orbit one last time, served not as a return to the old world, but as a closing echo of it. The snowy confrontation at Mount Hagane did not restore the gang, nor did it resurrect lost ideals. Instead, it offered resolution without restoration. Dutch's presence in that moment reflected the culmination of his own internal unraveling. He no longer stood as a commanding visionary, but as a solitary figure confronting the consequences of choices once framed as destiny. His final act, ambiguous and restrained, suggested that even he recognized the distance between dream and reality. With Micah's chapter ended, and the remaining threads of the gang scattered beyond retrieval, John returned not to triumph, but to responsibility. Beecher's Hope stood modestly beneath open skies, a structure neither grand nor symbolic in appearance, yet monumental in meaning. The frontier had changed irreversibly. Railroads carved through plains once dominated by riders. Towns expanded with electric light and organized law. The age of wandering outlaws dissolved into memory, preserved not in monuments, but in stories told quietly. John's future, however, was not free from shadow. Those familiar with the broader arc of his life understand that peace in this world remains temporary, that the government's reach extends even into domestic corners, and that redemption often carries delayed cost. Yet within the boundaries of Red Dead Redemption 2, the closing image of John working his land, sharing simple meals with Abigail and Jack, and watching the horizon with cautious calm provides a moment of earned stillness. Arthur's sacrifice did not erase violence from the world. It did not guarantee safety, but it created an opportunity. And opportunity, in a fading frontier, was a rare and precious gift. As the sun lowers over Beecher's Hope, and evening light softens the edges of fences and fields, the story settles into quiet acceptance. The journey that began in snow and ambition concludes in soil and responsibility. The outlaw era does not end with thunder. It fades with the sound of wind moving through grass, with distant cattle shifting in their pens, and with a man standing at his porch, aware that the freedom he now seeks is not found in escape, but in staying. And somewhere beyond the visible horizon, the memory of Arthur Morgan rides on not as legend, but as a choice that changed the course of another life.